Welcome to the first video on the Lord of the Flies. The purpose of this video tonight is to lay out some context for you, to raise some important questions about information you should know that lies beyond the book. So this is just going to give you a brief overview of what you're going to find in this video tonight. We're going to talk about an allegory, what it is and why it matters. We're also going to talk about what context is. What do I mean when I talk about novel context? We're going to talk about why the novel context is important, and then we're going to talk about how some of the context that you're going to lay out, you're also going to find in the book as you read. All right, this is an important definition. An allegory is a way of explaining something that can't really easily be explained because it's more abstract than concrete. So we tell people a story to try and explain it. A really good example is the way some religions interpret the Bible. A lot of Christian religions view the Bible as an allegory, that it's explaining the deeper meanings of what it means to be a Christian by telling stories to show what that means. An allegory in literature is a form of metaphor, and what this means is that the objects in the story, the characters of the story, and the plot line in the story are meant to represent something beyond the plot line of the story. What they represent could have meaning. It could be telling you about morals. It could be a reflection on social order. It could be a reflection on religion. It could be a reflection on politics. The characters are often meant to personify abstract ideas, and this is important. The characters in an allegory may really represent something big like charity, or greed, or envy, or anger, or hatred. So if you look at it this way, The Lord of the Flies, because it's an allegory, is a story that has two meanings. The literal story about boys stranded on an island, and a symbolic meaning, a comment that Golding is making about the world that he lived in. What's important to understand, why it's important to understand context when you're reading an allegory, is that because the allegory is something beyond literal story, it's going to be very hard to think about symbolism if you don't understand the time and the place that the story was written. Most window books tend to exist at a symbolic meaning, where most mirror books are pretty much a literal story. They tell you what they tell you, the people represent who they represent, and they fit into your world. Because The Lord of the Flies is a window book, it's not so simple, and that's why we need to talk a little bit about context. All right, context is simply the circumstances that the author was living in when he or she wrote the book. That means what was society like, what was going on in history, and what was the current literary trends at the time that the author is writing. Remember, and we've talked about this a lot, both in our writing and reading other people's writing, is that you can't help it. You are the sum of your experiences. What you have experienced, what you know, has affected what you believe and how you look at the world. And this is never more true than when you read someone else's literature. To understand a novel, you have to understand the time and the place that the author lived. You have to understand what it was that shaped that author's truth. So basically, I'm going to talk about history and society in the 50s. The book was written in the early 50s and published for the first time in 1954. And I don't care if you remember the date so much as remember that we're talking about the early 50s. So the things to remember is, first of all, Great Britain, which is where Golding lived, England, had just come through the Second World War. Food was still being rationed. Food was still an issue. The idea of a nuclear war had begun to emerge. At the end of World War II, when the Soviet Union became an enemy of the United States, that was when the Cold War began. After the war, and Golding was discharged from the military, he was a teacher at a private boys' school. And finally, the 1950s, Golding lived through a time when the British Empire was no longer the greatest empire in the world, and it had a huge impact on the way that people felt and thought. And finally, the early 1950s was a time when the public was just beginning to find out exactly what happened right before and during World War II in Germany. the death camps and the persecution of the Jews and the gypsies and the gay and the lesbian and the literary types and the scientists, that wasn't widely known until after the war had ended and it had began to come out in the public. So in the early 1950s, a lot of what was going on in Germany was just being explained or coming to light in the 50s. Okay, the Second World War, and I'm going to go through this quickly. I know you had World War II with Mr. Carley. Remember that the war lasted about 6 years, and Golding was right in the middle of it, so that a lot of what happened to him during the war gets explored in Lord of the Flies. The whole idea of Hitler and the supremacy of that Aryan race, the extent that he was willing to go to ensure this pure race, is just becoming known. This idea of Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest and how Hitler had taken that and had convinced an entire nation of people to believe in it. All of this is just being made public. Look at how the boys survive on the island. Look at how they decide who becomes the leaders, how they decide who takes sides, and think about that as you read the novel. Something else that just was coming out to people outside of Germany, of the conquered countries, was the presence of the SS. This was a group that was elite. It was fiercely loyal to Hitler, and they would do anything for him. They were famous for never showing human weakness. Watch how the boys fall into groups, and watch how they are persuaded to obey on the island. And finally, in the early 50s, the extent of what the average, ordinary German was willing to do, and some of the terrible things that were carried out without question come out. See if you can find parallels for this in the novel. This is something that is in the world that Golding was living in as he wrote the novel. Here's some pictures. This is what was in the media, newspaper then, some television, as Golding is coming along. How involved, how deeply ingrained Hitler's idea of the survival of the fittest and this race of supreme Germans. These pictures of Hitler Youth. The second big thing, or I guess the third big thing, was the idea of the Cold War. During World War II, the Soviet Union was an ally with Great Britain and France and the United States. Well, as soon as the war ended, the Soviet Union became a potential enemy of the West and began making threats. The United States, along with Britain and France, formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to try and keep the nuclear balance, but the people of Great Britain were terrified. They were within easy range of Russia's nuclear weapons, and because they knew what a weapon could do, we dropped nuclear weapons on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So the world knew what a nuclear weapon could do, and the people of Great Britain knew very well that if Russia launched an attack on them, most people would be wiped out. There would be very little hope of surviving a nuclear attack. And that time period in the early 50s became known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. What a pun, huh? Or irony. Mutually assured destruction means that if I launch a bomb on you, in the time that it takes for my bomb to hit you, you're going to have time to launch a bomb back on me, and we're both going to be destroyed. So no one will win. So Great Britain was living under this threat of the possibility of a nuclear war between the United States and Russia, and being caught in the middle. I see these are out of order. I'm sorry. That's why that wasn't like. Another thing about England in the 1950s is food was terribly short during the war. Between the trade embargo on the ocean, England is an island country, and the fact that they had the war effort, food was short. People had enough to eat. They had enough to survive, but there were no luxuries. Not things like meat, sugar, butter. Fresh fruit, they were luxuries. They were things you very seldom got during the war. And food was still short during the 1950s. So think about the role of food in the story. Another author, the author who wrote the Redwall series, he grew up during the same time period. And he said in an interview that he thinks that these rich, lush banquets play such a big role in his story because he was always hungry as a boy. There was none of that extra stuff when he was coming up. The other big thing about life in the 1950s is that until World War II, Great Britain had been the greatest power in the world. They were the greatest empire. They said that the sun never sets on the British Empire, that no matter what part of the world you were in, no matter where the sun was shining, there was land that belonged to the British Empire. But World War II virtually ended that. So they were having to get used to the fact that they weren't the most powerful nation in the world in the early 50s. And in Great Britain, the upper and middle classes always felt like it was up to them to keep control. As the greatest nation in the world, it was their idea of taking care of things, to be in charge and to organize others. And in the 50s, they're just coming to grips with the fact that this isn't true anymore. But you can see this British attitude with the way the boys act in the novel. Keep that in mind. Another part, I guess this should be number 4, is the social class in England. And here's where, if you're not aware of this, you're going to be very hard to put to understand why the boys do what they do. There was still a very strong social class in England. There still is, much more so than in the United States. In England, it was very important to know your place, to know what was and was not proper for you. If you were born poor or working class, the chances are you were going to die poor, working class. At the start of this novel, you can see the boys know exactly where they belong, where they fit in society. The upper classes of Great Britain were usually those aristocrats, the lords, the earls, the dukes, the ladies, and the lords. They had family money, old money that went back generation upon generation upon generation. They were the people that were born into wealth and held wealth. They had huge estates. These were people like the Queen and all of the royal family, the House of Lords. This is all the upper class. And if you look at the statistics from the early 1950s, 1% of the population of Great Britain owned 99% of that country's wealth. Now, by the time Golding begins to write his novel, this upper class is beginning to lose some of their grip on society, but they still held great power. And most upper class boys were sent to very, very prestigious, expensive schools like Eton, Harrow, Marlborough. Eton is where the King of England went to school. It's where William and Harry went to school. Very, very upper class. Even if you had the money, you couldn't get into Eton or Harrow if you weren't in the upper class. The next class was the middle class, and these were the people that actually had to work for a living, but their working wasn't so much as actually working, but owning things. The working class were people like professionals, doctors, lawyers, judges, people that owned factories, businesses, shop owners, things like that. These people would also want their children to have very good educations. They would be very well educated, probably through what we know as college, and they would go to private schools, boarding schools, but not the quality of Eton or Harrow. So the boys in The Lord of the Flies are from this class. They're a private school, private boarding school, but their families were either professional or they owned businesses. They weren't the wealthy of England. If you look closely in the first chapter, you find out that Ralph's dad is in the Navy, which would be a profession. And Piggy we're not sure of. His parents are dead and he lives with his aunt, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of money there. But they're very clearly middle class. The working class was the next class, and these were the people that worked for the middle class people. They worked in the middle class people's factories. They worked in the middle class professionals' offices. They typically were only educated till about the age of 14, and then they left school to get a job. The boys in this book are not working class boys. They're middle class boys. All right, so now why does this matter? It's important because you have to watch what you assume. And you know what assume means. We've talked about it in class. But when you go in and you read the story about these boys, and you think, oh, they're 14, they're like me. In ways they are like you, but in a lot of other ways they're not like you. They live in a social context that you don't live in. They live in a historical time that you haven't lived through. And you have to understand those forces to understand who they are and why they do what they do. And the reason that Golding doesn't explain all this in the book is because it would take away from the story. And the example I put in the the video here is be like, my writing a story about a girl like Britney Spears and assuming you understand who Britney Spears is. Well, if I explained Britney Spears, it would ruin my story. So when you read window books, it's often important to know a little bit about the time and the place that the author wrote in, because that's going to affect how he shapes his or her characters. And here's back to the characters. You can't assume that they're going to act like you do, because they lived in a time period that's different from yours. So their behavior is not going to be the same, and it's not going to be the same for the same reasons. It's important that you understand that. Does that mean you have to read a history book before you read a window book? Of course not. But you have to understand that if you don't know anything about the time and place, you're going to miss a lot. And that the purpose of the book is they're trying to tell you a story based on their own experiences to help you live your own life just a little better. So what? So here's the bottom line, guys, and this should be in your notes. When you read the assigned chapters for the first time, which is your first draft writing, to prepare for your first literature circle meeting, you're going to read what you've noticed, characters you picked up, connections you've made, ideas about what you think is going on to your novel. When you get into your literature circles, that's where you're going to begin to apply context. You're going to try and get beyond the literal level that you can agree with. You're going to try and look at context. You're going to try and look at what is he trying to tell us? What could these characters possibly stand for? Knowing what I know about Golding and the time and the place that he lived in when he wrote this, what could these boys be symbol for? What's the more important story that Golding's trying to tell me? And why does any of this matter? It matters because the reason that people read is to become better people. Lord of the Flies is a classic because it still speaks to us 60 years after it was written. It still has something to teach us about how to live in the world with other people. And that's why context matters. I hope that you enjoy the story, and I hope you've taken good notes. I'll see you.